There are writings that go unnoticed, hidden among more popular texts. Among all the letters in the New Testament, one of the smallest and least commented on contains a message that could transform the way many see faith and the church. The question is, why does such a short, apparently simple text contain such a powerful warning? Few realize that the third epistle of John is not just a greeting between brothers in faith. Behind his words is a story of conflict and leadership, pride and humility, truth and manipulation. John, the last living apostle, wrote to a man named Gaius, praising his hospitality and faithfulness. But at the same time, he denounced a leader called Diotrephes, who had become an obstacle within the Christian community. What was happening there was not an isolated problem. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something that still repeats itself in different forms throughout history. The first-century church was not just a group of believers gathered to share teachings. It was a space of tension, where the truth needed to be protected not only against external threats, but also against those within the community trying to use it for their own benefit. John's words span time because they touch on essential issues. What defines a true spiritual leader? To what extent can the desire for recognition corrupt faith? How can hospitality, a simple act of welcoming and caring for others, be one of the greatest expressions of Christian love? While some see this letter as a private note between brothers, the reality is that it carries an urgent and necessary warning. Christianity has always faced challenges, but not all of them come from outside. Many battles are fought within the community itself. Every word written by Joel has a weight that goes beyond his time. The story he tells is not just about Gaius or Diotrephes, but about any environment where leadership turns into control and where the desire for power overrides the truth. In the next few moments, we will delve into this conflict that spans centuries, revealing the challenges and lessons hidden in this letter, which, despite being short, carries a deep meaning. In the first century, the church was experiencing a decisive moment. Christianity, still young, expanded rapidly, but along with growth came challenges that went beyond Roman persecution. Among them, one of the most dangerous was the internal struggle for power and recognition. Within Christian communities, leadership should not be a matter of dispute, as Christ himself had taught that the greatest among you is the one who serves. However, some leaders began to act contrary to this principle, and it is exactly this conflict that John exposes in his third letter. The contrast between Gaius and Diotrephes illustrates two opposing positions within the church. Gaius, praised by John, represents humility and selfless service. He not only followed the truth, but also lived by it, showing hospitality to fellow believers. This behavior was essential for the survival of the early church, as Christian missionaries traveled constantly and depended on the generosity of the faithful to support themselves. On the other hand, Diotrephes personified pride and the thirst for control. John accuses him of enjoying having primacy among his brothers and of rejecting his apostolic authority. This detail reveals a larger problem. Diotrephes not only wanted to lead, but he wanted to be the only leader, ignoring any external guidance. He did not accept John's correction, and even worse, prevented other Christians from showing hospitality, going so far as to expel them from the community. This behavior reveals something that has been repeated several times throughout the history of the church. Leaders who, driven by the desire for power, began to see faith as an instrument of control. In the 4th century, for example, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, the church began to deal with a new reality. Leaders who were not only interested in serving God, but also in maintaining political and social influence. Over time, internal disputes, councils, and schisms emerged, often caused by the same problem described in John's letter: the struggle between humility and pride within Christian leadership. Diotrephes' stance is a warning for any generation. His behavior was not just a personal problem, but a risk to the entire community. When a leader seeks recognition above the collective good, he divides instead of uniting, weakens the faith of others, and transforms an environment of communion into a space of competition. Pride leads to exclusion, authoritarianism, and manipulation, while humility strengthens bonds of love and mutual service. John did not write this letter just to correct Diotrephes, but to leave a lasting teaching. He wanted Christians to identify this type of behavior and understand the dangers of ego-based leadership. In contrast, he exalts Gaius and Demetrius as examples of fidelity and genuine service. They were not interested in status, but in living according to the truth of the gospel. This conflict between humility and pride is not limited to the first century. To this day, many communities face the same problem. There are leaders who use their position to serve, and there are those who see the church as a means to achieve power. History proves that whenever pride takes the place of humility, the result is the same: divisions, distrust, and weakening of faith. The third epistle of John not only records a specific episode in the history of the early church, but also provides a universal principle. Where there is pride, there is destruction. Where there is humility, there is growth. Joan wanted his readers to understand this and take a stand. He not only praises Gaius for his correct stance, but also directly confronts Diotrephes, making it clear that this type of attitude could not be tolerated. The choice between humility and pride remains one of the most important within the Christian faith. Just as John warned his community, Christians today need to be aware of this danger and remember that true leadership is not in titles or positions, but in the willingness to serve and live according to the truth. Authority within the church has always been linked to spiritual responsibility and commitment to the truth. From the earliest years of Christianity, leaders were not chosen for status or social influence, but for their maturity in faith and the example of life they demonstrated. John, when writing his epistle, shows that true Christian leadership is not in the imposition of personal will, but in the ability to guide the faithful with humility and service. However, the presence of leaders like Diotrephes, who used their position to exert control, distorted the original purpose of authority in the church. Throughout history, this type of dispute for power has been a constant within Christian communities. The desire for influence, when not based on service and love for others, can lead to fragmentation and the weakening of collective faith. In the first century, the apostles were recognized as spiritual guides because they had walked alongside Christ and directly received his teachings. His authority was not based on titles, but on experience and the responsibility to transmit Christian doctrine faithfully. Over time, as the church grew and became structured, new leaders emerged, and not all of them had the same commitment to the truth. The Epistle of John exposes this conflict directly. While he sought to guide and strengthen the community, Diotrephes attempted to consolidate his rule by rejecting apostolic authority and preventing others from following the principles established by the first disciples. This stance not only weakened the unity of the church, but also created an environment of oppression where faith ceased to be a path to freedom and became an instrument of control. Joan, with his experience and discernment, realized the damage this could cause and therefore wrote this letter as a warning. Christian leadership has always been based on the idea that he who leads must be the first to serve. Jesus made it clear that greatness in the kingdom of God does not lie in the position held, but in the willingness to put the needs of others above one's own. This model contrasts with what was adopted by many over the centuries, where power and authority began to be used as means of obtaining prestige and influence. In the medieval period, for example, many church structures were marked by internal disputes between those seeking prominent positions, resulting in schisms and divisions that profoundly affected the Christian faith. Today, the concept of Christian leadership still faces similar challenges. In many communities, there are leaders who follow the model of humility and service, while others repeat Diotrephes' mistake, centralizing power and becoming authoritarian figures. This type of behavior alienates people and compromises the testimony of the church, causing many to stop actively participating in the faith because they feel oppressed or disillusioned with those who should guide them. John's epistle reminds us that authority within the church must be exercised with fear and responsibility. The true Christian leader does not seek personal exaltation, but acts like a shepherd who cares for his flock, guiding them along the path of truth and love. John exalts Gaius and Demetrius because they understood this responsibility and lived up to it. On the other hand, he exposes and condemns Diotrephes so that his stance would not serve as a model for others. Christian leadership cannot be separated from the character of those who exercise it. An honest leader, who truly follows the teachings of Christ, will never use his position to manipulate or oppress. John's epistle is a reminder that authority in the church should not be seen as a vested right, but as a call to service. When this principle is forgotten, the inevitable result is a departure from the true essence of the gospel. Christianity becomes stronger when its leaders understand that the greatest authority does not come from the position they occupy, but from the example they offer. John's letter not only condemns Diotrephes' behavior, but also offers clear direction on what it means to genuinely lead. This principle remains current and necessary because whenever authority is used for one's own benefit, instead of for the edification of others, the gospel loses its essence and its impact within the community. Hospitality has always been a practical reflection of the Christian faith, a living testimony of love for others and communion among followers of Christ. In the early years of Christianity, when communities were still forming, the way believers welcomed and supported one another was not just an expression of kindness, but an essential necessity for the survival and growth of the church. However, this practice was not always well accepted by those who sought to maintain control over the community. John's letter highlights this dilemma by confronting the stance of Diotrephes, who refused to welcome brothers in the faith and prevented others from doing so. The relationship between leadership and hospitality is clear. A leader who seeks to serve rather than be served understands that the church is not built on rigid authority, but on love and mutual care. John exalts Gaius because he demonstrated this understanding, opening his home to the itinerant brothers who traveled to preach the gospel. Diotrephes, on the other hand, saw hospitality as a threat to his influence, as welcoming missionaries meant being open to new instructions and true communion among believers, something that could weaken his dominance over the community. Diotrephes' refusal to practice hospitality was not a simple personal whim, but a reflection of his attempt to centralize power. Welcoming travelers meant recognizing that the Christian faith went beyond the borders of a single congregation and that the church was an interconnected body where everyone depended on each other. However, for a leader like Diotrephes, who wanted to impose his own authority, the idea of making room for other preachers was a direct threat to his position. He preferred to isolate his community rather than allow the truth to circulate freely among his brothers. Since the first centuries, hospitality has been one of the pillars of the church. First-century Christians met in homes, as official temples did not yet exist. It was common for hosts to offer not only a place to worship, but also food and shelter for preachers traveling between cities. This created an environment of closeness and strengthening of faith, where everyone shared what they had, ensuring that everyone was cared for. This model of community life was one of the great differences between Christianity and other religions of the time, and many were drawn to the faith by witnessing this unconditional love in action. The importance of hospitality became even more evident during periods of persecution. When Christians were hunted by the Roman Empire, they depended on each other to escape, find shelter, and gather to safety. This sense of protection and mutual care has kept the church alive in difficult times. Later, as Christianity became institutionalized, this welcoming culture was gradually replaced by more formal structures, but still the idea of welcoming and caring for those in need remained central to Christian doctrine. The contrast between Gaius and Diotrephes is repeated to this day. Many churches are known for their welcoming spirit, where new members are warmly welcomed and encouraged to integrate into the community. In others, hospitality is neglected, and the environment becomes cold and distant, more concerned with rules and hierarchies than with people's well-being. Recent studies show that one of the main reasons why people stop attending churches is not linked to doctrine, but to a lack of acceptance and sense of belonging. John's letter reminds us that hospitality is not a secondary detail in the Christian faith. It is a concrete demonstration that the church should not be a closed space, but a place of genuine communion, where everyone is welcome and cared for. When hospitality disappears, the church stops reflecting the character of Christ and becomes just another institution. On the other hand, when believers dedicate themselves to serving one another, they demonstrate that God's love is not just an abstract concept, but something real and accessible. This principle applies not only within temples, but in Christian life as a whole. The call to hospitality goes beyond opening the doors of a home. It means having a heart willing to welcome, listen, help, and walk together with those who need support. John emphasizes that Gaius was a faithful man because his life reflected this attitude, and it is this example that should continue to inspire Christians to live a practical and accessible faith. The story of Diotrephes serves as a warning about the dangers of pride within the Christian community. Not only did he refuse to welcome his brothers, but he also tried to prevent others from doing so. This stance not only contradicted the teachings of Christ, but also created an environment of division and exclusion, weakening communion among believers. John, in writing this letter, makes it clear that a leadership that does not promote acceptance and unity is moving away from the fundamental principles of the gospel. Gaius's example, on the other hand, reminds us that faith is demonstrated through actions. He did not seek recognition or prominence, but was remembered for his commitment to truth and his practical love. His hospitality was not just an act of generosity, but a reflection of his identity as a disciple of Christ. This type of attitude continues to be essential for the church to fulfill its true purpose and continue to be a place where everyone finds refuge, support, and spiritual growth. John wrote this letter to warn about the dangers of distorted leadership and lack of hospitality within the Christian community. His teachings remain current as the church still faces similar challenges. When believers choose to live according to the principles of love and service, they strengthen fellowship and demonstrate to the world the true meaning of Christianity. The invitation to hospitality is not just a suggestion, but a direct call for every Christian to reflect the character of Christ in their daily lives. Personal testimony has always been one of the most powerful tools for transmitting the Christian faith. From the earliest days of the church, the way Christ's followers lived said more about their belief than any speech or preaching. The character of a Christian, demonstrated by his attitudes, words, and way of treating others, was what differentiated true disciples from those who just professed the faith without living it. John, in writing his epistle, makes it clear that the way a person behaves directly reflects their relationship with God. The letter contrasts two types of testimony, that of Gaius and Demetrius, who lived in a way aligned with the truth, and that of Diotrephes, whose authoritarian and exclusionary behavior revealed a hardened heart. John emphasizes that a faithful testimony is not built with empty words, but with actions that demonstrate a real commitment to the gospel. He mentions Demetrius as someone whose testimony was recognized by all, a man whose life reflected the essence of the Christian faith. This detail teaches us that a true Christian does not need to promote himself or seek recognition. Your own conduct becomes living proof of your faith. The relevance of personal testimony goes beyond the individual sphere. In a context where the church was constantly watched by those who criticized it, Christians knew that their actions could strengthen or weaken the message they preached. In the first century, followers of Christ were often accused of heresy and even subversion against the Roman Empire. Upright behavior and willingness to help those in need became powerful arguments against these accusations. The personal testimony of each Christian was an essential part of the expansion of the gospel, because upon seeing the difference in the lives of these men and women, many felt attracted to discover this new faith. John knew that a faithful testimony could build the church just as much as a negative testimony could harm it. He condemns Diotrephes not only for his authoritarian leadership, but also because his actions were creating division and turning people away from the truth. Arrogance, lack of hospitality, and rejection of apostolic authority were not just internal problems, but a threat to the witness of the Christian community. A leader who seeks power for himself and acts contrary to the principles of Christ not only harms those around him, but also tarnishes the image of the faith he is supposed to represent. This warning remains valid today. The personal testimony of Christians influences the world's perception of the church and the message of the gospel. Research indicates that one of the main reasons why many people move away from the faith is not related to the doctrine itself, but to the inconsistency between what Christians preach and what they live. When the conduct of a leader or member of the church distances itself from the teachings of Christ, the negative impact can be profound, alienating those who could be interested in the gospel. On the other hand, an authentic testimony has the power to transform lives. Stories of Christians who live their faith in a sincere and committed way are often responsible for inspiring other people to seek God. John himself highlights that Demetrius had a good testimony, not only among his brothers, but even of the truth itself. This indicates that his life was in complete harmony with what he believed, without the need for justifications or speeches to convince others. He did not need to strive to prove his faith, as his conduct was enough to demonstrate his commitment to God. Building a solid testimony requires coherence and perseverance. This means that it is not enough to talk about the love of Christ. It is necessary to live it on a daily basis. Small gestures, such as demonstrating patience, being honest in all circumstances, and treating others with respect and compassion, are practical ways to reflect God's presence in a Christian's life. Faith cannot just be a speech, but something visible in the way we deal with challenges, relationships, and even those who think differently. John, when exalting Gaius and Demetrius, reinforces that a true Christian does not need titles or prominent positions to impact other people's lives. The simple fact of living with integrity is enough to leave a positive mark on the world. This is in direct contrast to Diotrephes, who sought recognition and power, but whose legacy was marked by John's disapproval and example of what should not be followed. Personal testimony also plays a fundamental role in preserving faith across generations. Since the beginning of the Church, the transmission of Christ's teachings depended not only on oral preaching and apostolic writings, but also on the way Christians lived these teachings. The first communities grew because their members demonstrated, through their actions, that the gospel was a transformative reality. Likewise, today, what most convinces people about the truth of Christianity are not just theological arguments, but the impact that faith has on the lives of those who practice it. The challenge of maintaining coherent testimony is constant. It is often easier to give in to the temptation to react impatiently, act out of self-interest, or seek human recognition. However, John's letter reminds us that the true follower of Christ is distinguished by his humility, his willingness to serve, and his commitment to the truth. Gaius and Demetrius were recognized for these qualities, while Diotrephes was marked by his arrogance and desire for control. The central lesson of the epistle is that the Christian faith manifests itself in concrete ways in everyday life. Personal testimony is not a secondary detail of spiritual life, but an essential element for the gospel message to continue impacting the world. Every attitude, every word, and every choice contributes to strengthening or weakening this testimony. John challenges us to reflect on how we are living our faith and whether our actions truly reflect what we profess to believe. History shows us that the impact of Christianity came not just from great preachers or influential leaders, but from countless ordinary men and women who lived their faith genuinely. It is these people who keep the essence of the gospel alive, demonstrating that following Christ is not just an abstract concept, but a daily commitment to truth and love. This is the true meaning of a powerful personal testimony. John's epistle left us with a timeless warning about the challenges the church faces, not only externally, but also within its own community. The confrontation between Gaius and Diotrephes was not an isolated episode in the history of Christianity, but a reflection of a conflict that continues to recur over the centuries. The dispute between humility and pride, service and authoritarianism, hospitality and exclusion, and truth and manipulation has always been present in faith communities, shaping the trajectory of Christianity and directly affecting its mission in the world. What differentiates those who really live the gospel from those who just use faith as a means for their own interests is practical testimony. João made it clear that it is not enough to know the truth, it is necessary to walk by it. He praises Gaius for his conduct, highlights Demetrius as an example to be followed, and condemns Diotrephes for transforming leadership into an instrument of domination. These three characters represent attitudes that continue to be seen within churches to this day. Christianity was built on the principles of humility and service, and whenever these values are set aside, the result is the fragmentation and weakening of faith. Leadership should not be based on the desire for recognition, but on the commitment to guide and care for others. Hospitality cannot be seen as an optional detail, but as an expression of genuine love that strengthens communion. Personal testimony is not only a way of building one's faith, but also of impacting those who observe the conduct of Christ's followers. History shows that whenever the Church has moved away from these principles, it has lost its positive influence on society and weakened its identity. The periods of greatest growth of Christianity were not marked by power structures, but by communities that lived their faith authentically, reflecting the character of Christ in their daily actions. On the other hand, moments of crisis and decline were often linked to the departure from these fundamental values. Diotrephes represents a threat that was not restricted to the first century. It symbolizes any leader or member of the Church who seeks status and authority instead of committing to truth and love for others. His behavior serves as a reminder that the pursuit of power within faith can corrupt even those who started out with good intentions. Their rejection of hospitality and their desire for exclusion show that the centralization of leadership can often stifle the spiritual growth of a community. Gaius, in turn, exemplifies the true disciple. He did not hold a prominent position, but he was recognized for his loyalty and generosity. His commitment to the truth was not just theoretical, but manifested itself in the way he treated others. This is the true greatness within Christianity, not the one who seeks to be served, but the one who chooses to serve. Demetrius reminds us that a good testimony does not need to be forced. His life was proof of what he believed, and this was recognized by everyone around him. This is the impact of genuine faith. It does not depend on titles or positions, but is reflected in the way each person chooses to live daily. John's letter invites us to reflect on the type of influence we are exerting within our community. Are we closer to Gaius and Demetrius, living an authentic faith and showing love for others? Or are we somehow repeating the mistakes of Diotrephes, putting our own interests above the truth of the gospel? This is a question that every Christian needs to ask continually. The lessons contained in this brief epistle continue to challenge the modern church. The need for humble leaders, welcoming communities, and coherent testimonies has never been more urgent than today. In a world where faith often mixes with personal and political interests, where love for others is placed in the background, John's message becomes even more necessary. The challenges may change over time, but the principles remain the same. True Christianity is not built around power structures, but on the sincere experience of truth. João wrote to warn about internal threats that could compromise the church, and this warning remains valid. The destiny of faith is not in the hands of a few leaders, but in the way each follower of Christ chooses to live and represent the gospel in the world. If there is anything that the Epistle of John teaches us, it is that true influence within the church does not come from the title one carries, but from the integrity with which one conducts oneself. Those who live the truth, who welcome others, and who remain faithful to the essence of the gospel are those who truly make a difference. Christianity does not need authoritarian leaders, but committed servants. Faith is not strengthened by power, but by the practice of love and justice. The impact of a life lived in fidelity to the truth is something that resonates far beyond the time of a single generation. Just as Gaius and Demetrius were remembered for their witness, every Christian has the opportunity to leave a legacy based on faith and genuine love. The big question that this epistle leaves us with is, how are our choices contributing to the strengthening of the church and the spread of the true gospel? John ends his letter wishing to meet his brothers in person, as he knew that some truths can only be fully shared in close contact, in direct contact, in the communion that strengthens faith. Perhaps this is one of the greatest messages of this epistle. The Christian faith was not meant to be lived in isolation, but in community, where truth, love, and hospitality become evident in the way we relate to each other. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so we can continue to bring you more research and in-depth analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps the channel grow and produce even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support. I want to thank you for taking the time to learn about this important message. Christian faith is not just about what we know, but how we choose to live. And sharing this knowledge strengthens the community and helps to bring this reflection to more people. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel. This helps us to continue bringing studies and themes that deepen the understanding of the scriptures. And of course, leaving your like and commenting below is a way of supporting this work and contributing to this space of learning and exchange. Don't stop here. In the next video, we're going to talk about a topic that can change the way you see passages that often go unnoticed. So, click on the recommended video and continue on this journey of knowledge. See you there.